Welcome back. Today's episode is with Alan Gilpin, CEO of World Rugby. Alan's first job was splitting firewood at a village pub at the age of 12, and now he leads one of the world's most storied global institutions. As CEO of World Rugby, he leads a federation of 133 nations where he drives innovation, expands into new markets like the US, Morocco, and Jordan, and ensures how the sport evolves without losing its values. Before stepping into the top role, Alan ran the Rugby World Cup, built a career in commercial law, and held pivotal leadership roles at the London 2012 Olympics. Today, we dive into Alan's playbook, how to move from the number 2 to the CEO seat, how to lead with curiosity in a complex global ecosystem, and how to build culture across continents while adapting to a world that moves faster than ever. Let's get to it. So, Alan, you've had an amazing career. You started in the legal industry, right? That's your background. You eventually found your way to hospitality, getting to work London 2012. I want to get there. Today, you're CEO of World Rugby. We're going to spend a lot of time there. What was the first job you were ever paid for?
I was paid, believe it or not, I'm in my early 50s, so it doesn't not that long ago, but when I was 12, I was paid by my local pub, so local pub and restaurant, to chop up wood to light fires for Sunday roast. It's Sunday lunchtime. And actually, the idea now that you'd pay a 12-year-old to wield an axe on a Sunday morning probably wouldn't pass much muster from a health and safety perspective, but it was great. And, one of those things where you just, I say this to my kids all the time who are a bit older than that now, learning the value of money because you have to earn it yourself when you're that young, I think stood me in really good stead for a long time. So, loved it. And I ended up working in that same pub in different roles for about the next 10 years and loved it, yeah.
So there was 2 paths you could have gone there. You could have gone down hospitality. The world also needs more lumberjacks. So you were at this moment in your career.
I did.
And you said hospitality. It never even crossed your mind, hey?
No. I should have stuck with the wood.
You should have stuck with the wood. Yeah. Some people have said that. That's why I brought you here today. I just didn't want to share imagine some of the market feedback. That's amazing. So one of the things that we're intentional about at home is just recognizing that you do have to give kids some responsibility and decision-making power when they're young and let them make mistakes, because helicopter parenting doesn't help the kid. It really just makes us as parents feel good.
Totally.
But wielding an axe at 12, that's a lot of responsibility.
Yeah. And actually, most of the sort of limbs intact. So actually, I did okay.
Yeah. So I'm going to start with a rugby quote for you. Former England rugby coach Clive Woodward once said, "There's a complete parallel with running a successful sports company as there is with running a successful sports team. You need the same skills." Do you agree? And if so, what do you think Clive meant?
Clive actually wrote extensively about the kind of comparisons between, I think, building the winning team that he had back in 2003 Rugby World Cup when England were world champions and running businesses. And he'd done a bit of that, I think, just before he took over as kind of England coach in the run into that World Cup. So I think he's right. I think there's about identifying and managing talent first and foremost. And he did a great job of that. But that's obviously true in sports teams as it is in business. And then there's that piece around, focus, purpose, I guess having a plan, in some cases a business plan, or having a plan for a team that's making sure you're delivering the best impact for the talent that you've got, and that understanding, as they certainly did, what success looks like and what you're driving towards. So I think there's definitely a lot of that that's true. It's probably slightly oversimplified in the world we're in now, but no, and I see that all the time. I mean, we're lucky. I always think it's a huge privilege to work in the sports industry. I still say to people now, sort of 30 plus years on it, it beats a real job. And there are huge parallels. We keep coming back to sporting analogies all the time, I think, in what we do.
Yeah, I think a big difference, to your point, sporting parallels, is if you're running a corporation in another industry, most people don't recognize you in the street, and you don't have a lot of bosses. You might have your board. In your job today, I imagine there's a lot of people who think that they're the boss of World Rugby. Is that a fair guess?
Yeah, there are, and it's and it's interesting. And again, look, I'm hugely privileged to work in a sport that's actually very collegiate, where most of the time you're working with really good people who all want to see everybody else being successful. So, it's a great environment to work in. There are a lot of different tensions, and we're, as an organisation, we've got 133 nations, 133 members in our federation, in our membership, and 6 regional associations, and then you've got the professional leagues and the players' representative bodies, and so there's a huge, diverse set of views in all of that. And a big part of the job that I probably didn't appreciate enough, even though I was in the organization when I took the job, a huge part of the job is navigating that and actually just trying to make everyone feel like they're heard and they're being listened to. And that's a big task and takes a lot of resource in the organization. And then ultimately trying to find a way through that's taking the sport forward still. So yeah, that's the challenging part of the role, but it's also why I think, we're being successful as an organization and growing as a sport, because enough of us are kind of finding our way through that, I think.
Yeah, it's been exciting to watch rugby over the last several years. And as I think of a job like yours, selective empathy comes to mind. You have to be able to put yourself in the other person's shoes and say, sure, if I were in their shoes, I could feel the same way. But we have to make decisions for the collective, not always the individual nation or individual part of the sport.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have this inherent tension, I think, in a sport like rugby, and it's not unique to rugby. Other sports certainly have it, where we've got a group of very established core markets, if we can sort of say that in business term, or nations where rugby's been played for a long time and is a established sport. We happen to have in rugby a challenge where many of those core markets are relatively small markets economically, and that means that our core has a degree of kind of fragility in it that maybe other sports aren't seeing as much. And then we've got this obviously amazing kind of opportunity for the sport to grow in newer markets, or markets where the sport's less established, because it's not necessarily that the game hasn't been played in Japan or the USA for a long time. It has, but it might be less established as a professional sport, and certainly as a sport that drives commercial value. We need our existing core markets to come with us on the journey. It can't be growth at their expense. They are the places where both in the community game and in the professional game, the most players are, where the women's game's really driving forward. So we've got to find a way of balancing, keeping the core strong and finding the growth. And that's got an inherent tension in it that I think we kind of grapple with all the time.
For those who might not fully understand, what is World Rugby in the ecosystem of rugby? And what does the chief executive officer do on any given Monday through Friday? 8 to 5. It shuts down at 5:01. I know.
Not the things that people think. I don't spend all my time watching rugby, fun enough. Yeah, so World Rugby, I mean, two pieces now, really. And again, that's probably oversimplifying it, but we are the governing body of the game. So we're responsible for the way the game is played, the laws or the rules of the game. So the kind of shape of the product on the field, the appointment of match officials, the sort of underlying landscape of the sport. And that's everything from anti-doping in competitions around the world through to protecting the integrity of the game. So all the pieces around, manipulation of results and match fixing, all of those issues, safeguarding, medical policy. We have a huge focus as a sport on player welfare and player safety. We're a collision sport, so we have to have, and we work very closely with other sports in that space. So there's a lot of core activities there, leading training and education programs around the world that underpin the growth of the sport. So they're all responsibilities you have as an international federation or a governing body for a sport. And we're pretty good at that, I think, and we're looking always to invest more in more of that and how we do those things better. On the other hand, we own events and properties, and we need to be better as a business at commercializing and exploiting men's and women's rugby world cups, our HSBC 7 series, etc., that underpins our 7 sports. So they're two quite different skill sets, two quite different parts of the organization, and we're trying to drive both forward simultaneously. So my responsibility in sort of leading the organization is to get the balance right of investing in those different areas, but also get the balance right in terms of driving that forward and making sure that our competitions drive our appeal to a younger audience, for example, is absolutely key. And if we don't get that part right, we're not going to have the resources we need to invest in all the things we do that actually underpin the sport. So yeah, it's no 2 days are ever the same, that's for sure. A lot of the challenges, I say, aren't unique to rugby, but we have our unique take on a lot of those challenges. But ultimately, it's an absolute honour and a privilege to be doing it. So I'll never complain around the job.
What do you think is the biggest misconception about your job?
I think the biggest misconception within the sport is that we are, again, this kind of, old-fashioned governing body that's not really in tune with some of the challenges that our membership are facing. And I think we're much more in tune with our membership and the challenges, again, that they're facing in a very fast moving, attention economy that all of sport and entertainment's in. So we're closer to them on that than I think they think sometimes. And I think more broadly outside of our own ecosystem, I think there's probably a perception that, well, rugby's just sort of 10 to 15 countries, isn't it? And therefore it can't be that hard to manage it. Whereas again, we're in a lot more places than people realize, I think.
And you were promoted into this job from running the Rugby World Cup, right?
Yeah.
So that's how you ended up getting into the seat that you're in.
Yeah, I joined World Rugby. I never thought I'd work in an international federation, very much commercial legal background, as you mentioned. And I was involved in commercializing major events and left and did a stint with the London Olympics, which was amazing. And then was persuaded by my predecessor, Brett Gosper, who I know you know, who's now doing great things with the NFL, persuaded by Brett to come in and sort of help re-look at how they were commercializing Rugby World Cups, men's and women's, and was in the organization then, so 11 years ago now, believe it or not. And then from there, kind of progressed and became Brett's number two and ultimately promoted into the role during COVID, which was a really interesting time to take over. And it's interesting because I look back at that and I think, when you compare people who come into roles without being in the organization, I don't think the challenge is necessarily any easier or harder when you come from within. But I do think in the case of taking the role during COVID, it would have been incredibly difficult for somebody to do that if they hadn't had the organizational knowledge that I was lucky enough to have to kind of navigate us through that piece.
So a lot of organizations hope that succession can occur from within, but it often isn't the case. So what did Brett do right? What did you do right? What did the board do right to be able to equip you to step into that role when it became available?
I think I was very lucky, and I'd like to think, therefore, the organisation was lucky, but that's for others to judge, in the sense that Brett gave me a lot of exposure during probably the last 4 years. Certainly, I was quite well established as the managing director of Rugby World Cup, so he gave me a lot of exposure to the other parts of the organisation that weren't directly in my sort of day-to-day remit. I think that really helped me, again, more than I realised at the time, to take that next step. He was fantastic from that perspective. I think he really understood, and this is something that's always on my mind now, that you need to be building that succession plan for quite a long period. It's not something you can think about with a year or 6 months to go until some change is going to occur. You need to be building that. If you're going to be able to promote from within, as you say, and organisations want to, and we certainly want to across a lot of roles, then you need to be quite thoughtful about that on a continuous basis. So Brett was very good in that regard. I mean, I was a very willing successor in the sense that I stepped into those spaces I really wanted to sort of see into other parts of the organisation. Again, not necessarily at the time thinking that meant I was going to end up being the CEO of World Rugby. And, I had my moments like everyone does of thinking, okay, does my future now lie somewhere else? But I certainly wanted to build up those skills to be able to take the next step. And we had a great board at the time. And again, it was a particular moment in time because whilst COVID was incredibly tough for rugby and for many of our members, as it was, across so many sports, we were very fortunate. We have our major revenue generating event once every 4 years, a men's Rugby World Cup. It's quite a precarious business model. And we'd had that at the back end of 2019 in Japan, a hugely successful, brilliant Rugby World Cup. And therefore, we weren't under the same financial pressure when COVID hit that maybe lots of other organisations in sport were. We were therefore in a position to help our members pretty significantly in that period, both financially and in other respects. And I think, that was something that was, very much our board pushing for at that time. So I think, as I say, I think it would have been very difficult for someone to come from outside the organisation at that moment.
Some people who listen to this might be in a number 2 role today, and they might be up for an internal number 1 role. Having gone through that transition yourself, what advice would you give to that person when they land the most senior role within that organization about how they onboard themselves and how they transition from peer to boss, because that's what's happening?
Yeah, look, I think if you're in the organisation and you've got ambitions to, in any part of that, to continue to progress through the organisation, I think, and I say this a lot to colleagues, it's really important to develop your style, to develop the trust that hopefully your peers who are also in leadership roles have in you, so that transition to being their boss isn't hard. And I'm lucky, again, working with some fantastic colleagues now who were peers at the time, and now I'm in a leadership team with, I think I've got great relationships that I'd had over a period of time. So that kind of authenticity, I think, my philosophy, and again, it comes back to kids and parenting, doesn't it? And one of the things I say to my kids all the time as they kind of start to make their way in the world, that I think is so true in business and within organizations is if you just treat people how you'd like to be treated, that's going to take you a long way. In whatever sort of decision making, building trust, being authentic. I think if you're doing that, if you're thoughtful about how you'd like to be treated in a particular situation, I think that takes you a long way. So I think that's, certainly again, the team that I work with in the leadership of World Rugby. And when we think about succession and we think about promoting from within, I want to see people displaying those behaviors. Often it's a given that the day job you can do. It's those values, I think, that are going to take people further.
Likability is underrated, I think, in
definitely.
some organizations, but all things being equal or even close to equal, people are going to want to work with people that they like. And we're in an environment now where I think it's harder for jerks to stay in senior leadership roles because there's also really capable, likable people.
Yeah.
Not just capable, unkind people.
Absolutely. I mean, I was lucky enough to be at IMG just about at the time when Mark McCormick was still at the helm. And Mark, said constantly, people like doing business with people they like doing business with. As you say, likability is very underrated. You don't have to be a jerk to get on. And particularly in an industry like sport, where I think relationships and trust is so important to people in terms of, relationships forged over a long period of time and established relationships between different parts of different organizations. You can't come in and throw all that away, for sure.
So go back to this rising chief executive. First 90 days, what do they need to do to establish themselves in that position?
I think now, and again, looking back, and I'm 4 years in the post, I think one of the things I would say to anybody in an organization being promoted from within to the top job is actually you've got such a huge benefit of that inside knowledge, but maybe in that first 90 to 100 days, act like an outsider. So I think if you come in with the lens of what would an outsider do, but with the benefit of the insider knowledge, you've got such an advantage, therefore, over others. Why do I say that? I think there's a danger when you're a candidate promoted from within that you don't want to change too much. You've come through the system. That system's obviously served you pretty well if you've now arrived at the top job. Why would you change too much too quickly? I think that can be quite a dangerous view. How do you interpret what you know about the organization into a place where actually I think I know what needs to be changed to take us to the next level of success? So it's combining that outsider view and the inside knowledge, I think.
I love that advice. So just being in the people business, I tend to study those transitions, and more often than not, when an organization is doing very well, it's prudent to strongly consider an internal promotion. It's often the better decision, not always, but often. When it's not the better decision, the insider usually derails to a more significant degree than the outsider would have derailed. And I find oftentimes it's, to your point, they never put on the outsider viewpoint, or they might have continued their job. They might have stayed chief revenue officer, but with a CEO title, or stayed CFO, but with a CEO title. The other pieces I've noticed is that sometimes that outsider, or all times those outsiders would have had a meeting with the board to say, hey, what's expected? And here's how I'm going to measure myself, and here's how I think you should measure me. The insider doesn't always do that. The insider just sometimes presumes, hey, I got promoted because they think things are going well. They never actually established success metrics.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think this is true again, and I would say advice to anybody within an organization looking to progress, ultimately, to a top position in an organization, is you've got to have your own vision of how you can take the organization to the next part of whatever success is, and not just, as you say, sort of sit on your laurels and think, well, I've got here because I'm the right person for the job. So that outsider perspective of what would I do differently to what's being done now, I think is important. And one of my kind of pet hates in business, and again, something I probably bore my own leadership team with too much is, the answer to any question can't be, we do it this way because we've always done it this way. And if that's the answer, we need to be thinking differently. I think in sport, particularly we're a 200-year-old sport and a 150-year-old organisation, and we're not unique in rugby with those sorts of numbers. So there's a hell of a lot of built-up tradition, and that's brilliant. And there's the heritage part of what we do is so valuable and so important. But the world's moving really fast, and we need to be capable of, understanding what success looks like in a very different world now. And so we need to be doing things differently and challenging ourselves on that all the time.
So on that point, the world's moving really fast. You're already pulled in a lot of directions. How do you as a chief executive continue learning, refining your own skills, knowing how business is evolving, AI, new technologies, et cetera? What are you doing, and what advice do you have for others to make sure they're doing that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you know, I think, and again, I sort of use parenting as an example. And one of the things, again, I'd probably, you know, say far too much to my kids, and they roll their eyes as late teenagers now.
How old are your kids now?
17 and 19.
Oh, so they know more than you now.
They know more than me for sure, and they really do in many cases, which is frightening. They're great because they're actually that point of accountability, aren't they? I mean, the kids at that age, my daughter, who's super bright, I mean, and you know, a complete social activist, as 19-year-old bright girls are. You know, Dad, I've heard you talking about environmental sustainability and rugby a lot. What are you actually doing? It's like, wow, okay, we get straight to the
yeah.
So they're brilliant like that. But I think
as she's pouring the milk into the cereal bowl in the morning.
But the great thing, and I sort of say to them, I guess it's kind of my personal philosophy a little bit around work and life is kind of 3 C's. And I think whatever situation you approach, and I try and keep these things in mind, you know, be calm, be confident, and be curious. But I think that curious piece is actually the most important bit. I think I read fairly voraciously, and like you, I travel a lot, so I spend a lot of time on planes, and I'm really interested in business and commerce and investment. And there is so much that sport can learn from other, you know, other areas of business and, you know, and investment and politics and life. So, and ultimately we're selling our product to to the whole, you know, population out there. So we need to be in tune with a lot of those things. So I think, you know, and again, one of the things that I try to do, and I'm constantly trying to be better at, is creating enough time to be learning about what's going on that's not just looking inward at either rugby or even at sport. And that is time consuming. I think that, again, one of my reflections over the last 4 years in the role is you need to carve out time to do those things, to spend time talking to people in, you know, in other industries. And in order to do that, you've got to make sure you're delegating better than you were in the previous role, because probably in the previous role, certainly in my previous role, you were doing more. Now it's about doing less, delegating more, leading better. And leading better means, you know, spending that time being curious about what's going on in different places. So, you know, I make that sound easy. It's not easy because, you know, you've got to create the time to do that and to be learning and have a learning agenda. But I think it's really, really important for us.
How does that look in practice? Do you have blocks on your calendar to ensure that you have that type of thinking or reading time?
Trying to. And again, you know, putting things aside for those blocks, making sure that I'm sort of staying in touch. I think it's very easy, again, in the sports industry, and we're all guilty of this, to attend lots of functions in the sports industry. And actually what's really interesting, I think, is to use the opportunity, and they are there, to go and hear from other industries. And that's been really interesting. I mean, obviously we're in a fascinating kind of geopolitical, you know, place in the world right now. And learning about that, and then again, discussing that with the leadership team that I have in place, who are, again, a super bright bunch of people with very different global experiences, and then trying to think about what does that mean for us? What does the shifting, you know, geopolitical landscape mean for rugby in the next 10 years or the next 5 years? You know, and that doesn't mean we're going to predict all those things well, but at least we're thinking it through.
So you said you're a voracious reader. Give me something that I need to read. What's something you've enjoyed recently or over time that I should add to my reading list?
Oh, God, so many. I've got a business coach, who's a brilliant guy who every now and again will, you know, probably a couple of times a year, will give me a book, normally before I'm about to have some leave. One he gave me a couple of years ago, which is brilliant, is a book which is all short anecdotes from people from all walks of life, from people in the public eye to political leaders, called If I Could Tell You Just One Thing. And each chapter is their best piece of advice.
Oh, that's great.
Which is a fabulous read. And again, something you can pick up and put down and go back to. He also, the same coach also gave me a number of years ago, before it was a film, the story Boys in a Boat, and the story of that amazing, you know.
I have it and I haven't read it yet.
And like so many times, and the film's great, but the film doesn't do the book justice. I mean, the book is sensational. And buried away in what is obviously an incredible set of human stories and an incredible set of sort of sporting stories are these brilliant leadership lessons about how they, you know, and about teamwork, about how, you know, a team that shouldn't have won an Olympic gold medal in incredibly challenging circumstances in Nazi Germany did just that. So I think, yeah, it's a brilliant book.
I'm reading Carlo Ancelotti's leadership book right now, Quiet Leadership, and it is fantastic. I've really enjoyed it. I had one of the most successful
Yeah.
coaches across any sport, having won championships in multiple countries. And he's really structured in how he manages and leads organizations. It's thoughtful through and through. So if you haven't read it, Quiet Leadership is a good one.
Yeah. As a Liverpool fan, he's definitely a thorn in the side. So
you don't want to talk about it. See, he did coach Everton for a couple of days, a little bit longer.
And Madrid for a long time.
Yeah, a little bit longer. Talk to me about rugby. Where's it going? What are you most excited about with rugby over the next 5 years?
Again, it's a fascinating time to be in a sport like rugby. Again, I think that really interesting balance. We've got some great rugby being played on the field. We're going to have a really sensational Women's Rugby World Cup here in England this year. I think it's going to put women's rugby on a stage it's not been on before in terms of global visibility. We've got some absolute rock stars in women's rugby. The last Women's Rugby World Cup just 3 years ago in New Zealand delayed a year. The semi-finals and final of that competition were amongst the best games of rugby you'll ever see, gender aside. Last Men's World Cup, obviously in France a couple of years ago, again, sensational, the sort of quarters, semis, final. And then we had the Paris Olympics last year with rugby sevens, again, incredible. So there's not a lot wrong at the very best end of what's happening on the field. The quality of the product is fantastic. Our challenge, I think, as a sport and as a sport that wants to grow is how do we bring more fans to what is a fantastic game? And, we're quite a difficult sport to understand and to bring new fans to. So we've got to, always keep challenging ourselves. How do we make the broadcast product better? How do we make the experience for fans in the venue for the first time they go there better, so that we can turn more of the kind of casual fans we have that we know are there because we see them around World Cups and Olympic Games into people who are consuming rugby more of the time, and then translate that into more people playing the game. Health of the sport has to be, it's growing from a participation perspective and then more people playing the game. It's growing from an audience perspective around the world, and hopefully it's growing from a commercial revenue perspective, and that allows us to just keep investing more. So it's an exciting time, but it's also a very challenging time because, again, we're in an attention economy where we're competing for attention and share a wallet with everything else that people are doing. So, but again, it's a privilege to be involved in the sport that is trying to do those things.
By the time this comes out, it won't have been last week. So I'll preface this with that. But last week, we were flipping through the channels and it was the final 10 minutes of England-France. And if that wasn't one of the most thrilling endings in any sport, just to see numerous lead changes in a game that was a pretty quiet game leading up to that. And my whole household screaming. We don't have a team in the fight, so to speak. We're just excited by the momentum of it. It's just about sometimes people seeing a sport and experiencing it, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I think that's drama, isn't it? I mean, ultimately, whether you're in the stadium and paying for a ticket, you want to be entertained with drama. It's not always about, as you say, the highest scoring game or the game where necessarily every skill is executed perfectly, but it's about drama. It's about, again, those leads changing hands. Again, I go back to the last Women's Rugby World Cup and both semi-finals and the final decided by a single score. Amazing. And again, we go back to Olympics and Rugby Sevens in Paris, just incredible drama on the field, some brilliant stories. There are brilliant characters in the game. And I think if we can just show people more of that and do a better job of projecting that to both to existing markets for us and new markets, then we've got something really special.
Speaking of new markets, rugby is growing in non-traditional markets. Morocco, Jordan, Montenegro, the United States. What's driving that type of expansion right now?
I think a number of things. I think, look, we've got a game, again, that's been very established for a long time in a relatively small number of core or established markets, if we can call them that. Rugby's been played in a lot of places for a long time, but maybe hasn't done a great job of growing and trying to be more established. I mean, and we've got some really exciting markets for the sport. I mean, you've mentioned a few there, some of whom are new members in the World Rugby membership. But you look at a market like Spain. Rugby's got a really strong base in Spain. Spain's an incredible market for all sports, whether we're talking, football, basketball, handball, individual sports like golf and tennis, athletics. So, rugby should be a much bigger sport than it has been traditionally in a market like Spain that's sport mad. And now we've got this brilliant situation with some very good people involved in the sport in Spain, I should say, where the men's team have just qualified for the next World Cup. So they'll be in Australia with us in 2027. The women's team are in the World Cup this year in England in the 15-a-side game. The Spanish men's sevens team sits second in our world rankings, in our standings, I should say, for this season. So amazing. We've got a job to do to make it easier for Spanish fans, therefore, to consume what's happening. And I think that's the journey we're on that's helping the sport to grow is, we're really working hard to provide the content and the platforms that allow fans around the world to follow their team and see rugby. I think the other thing that we're starting to do as a sport, and we're traditionally poor at this, but from a good place, which is rugby. Many people would tell you this who are involved in rugby. It's the ultimate team sport. You can't be successful as a rugby player on your own. So as it requires a team to be successful at rugby. That's brilliant in terms of values, but it's probably held us back when we look at other sports in terms of creating stars, individual stars. And we know that a younger set of fans now around the world are following stars more than they are probably teams. We need to give people permission to be stars in our sport without that, impacting the kind of, team first ethos. As we do that, I think we're going to see again more growth in those markets that are developing for rugby. And the US is a great example of that. We've been very intentional about awarding the staging of future Rugby World Cups, men's and women's, to the US with quite a good runway, a number of years in advance.
Maybe 2031 and 2033, right?
Yeah, and we've got the benefit of obviously the LA Olympics there in 2028 and Rugby Sevens again having that platform to help American fans, follow rugby more. So again, it's using those big pinnacle moments and building around them to build fandom that will make those World Cups more successful. So the growth opportunity is definitely there. It's hard. Those things are hard and there's no easy answer. We're seeing, obviously, whether it's the NBA, NFL, MLB doing the same in reverse, if you like, expanding from dominance in the US market to other parts of the world. And there's lots to learn from how we're all doing that differently.
How much crossover is there in fan bases? You think of a traditional rugby match versus sevens, same fans, different fans, watching the men's game versus watching the women's game, same fans, different fans. What does that look like?
Yeah, I think it's different in different places. And there are some, diehard, old school 15-a-side fans who'd say, well, it's men's 15s rugby and, I'm not going to watch the other forms of the game. There are some fans who are sevens first for sure and love the kind of high octane, and brilliant entertainment that a weekend of sevens in Hong Kong or Dubai or somewhere else in the world might bring. So they're people with different preferences. We know that a lot of fans, again, particularly in less traditional markets, come to sevens first. They're seeing sevens first. And Olympics is a massive opportunity for us there. Olympics, rugby sevens being an Olympic sport is putting rugby into people's, living rooms or into their consciousness in a way that we wouldn't have if we weren't Olympic sports. That's really important. I'll take an example of, the leading form of rugby in India will be rugby sevens. We won't compete with cricket for attention of teenage boys necessarily, but we can go and Indian women's sevens can be the leading form of rugby and be attractive to lots of people. So we've got to accept that it's not one size fits all and that sevens is going to do a job for us in some markets. And sometimes it'll be women's sevens first and men's 15s or vice versa.
So on that same note, you were talking about younger audiences wanting stars. That's part of what they want. So that's a shift that's starting to occur in the sport. What other innovations or platforms are being established, maybe through digital broadcasting, through fan experience in stadiums, to attract a younger audience to the sport?
Again, I think rugby, and it's not unique to rugby, other sports have the same challenges. We've not done as good a job as we need to of creating a brilliant fan experience in the venue. We focus very much on let's put great rugby on the field and the fans will enjoy that. We now know if you're going to attract young families, if you're going to attract a Gen Z audience, you've got to provide an environment that, yes, has got the sport at its heart, but it's got more entertainment than that. So I think the sport, and we're one stakeholder in that with World Cups and the events that we run, but the sport is doing a better and better job of competing for attention in that way. The US market teaches us all a lot of lessons. I think Super Bowl recently being the next example of it's not about just the game anymore. It's about everything that's going on, in a week, in that case, around a single match, which is incredible. And then I think outside of the live match experience, one of the things, again, we've certainly worked really hard on from a World Rugby perspective, again, with the competitions that we directly control in the last couple of years, is you've got to be giving fans the content in the style they want it, which is a lot more short form content than it used to be, and in the places they want it. It's not a case of we're going to put some social and digital content on the channels that we decide and they're going to come and find it. No, you've got to be where they are. You've got to take the content to where those fans are that you want. And so TikTok's become a huge outlet for us. And again, that's an area where players can really play in as individuals and become the stars that they should be. We've got rock star players, unbelievable athletes, performing at an incredibly high level on the field. They deserve to be stars. How do we help them do that? And again, we're going to see that in the Women's World Cup this year, where I think we're going to give those players permission to be themselves, to let their personalities shine through.
Quick interruption. If you are enjoying the Excellent Leadership Podcast, I have a small favor to ask you. Could you please take a moment to like, subscribe, and leave a 5-star review? It helps us grow the Excellent Leadership Podcast community and ensures we keep bringing you top-tier guests, powerful insights, and impactful episodes. Thanks for your support. Now, back to the show. To be successful in your role, you need to have the right team around you. So here comes a really broad question. What are some of the learnings that you've had over the years in building and developing a high-performing management team?
Great question. Look, I think, again, my probably key learnings, again, in the last number of years are that blend of skills that you need. And, the danger is probably as a leader, sometimes you look for colleagues and to build a team probably too much in your own image. And I think I've tried to guard against that a little bit. I'm always looking for people who are authentic, prepared to be a bit vulnerable, because I think being really candid as a leadership team is really important, and you need a lot of trust in each other to be that open and honest, I think. But the results, come through from doing that. So I think someone gave me once a very good piece of advice that I've tried to follow. Again, it's one of those ones I always try and keep in mind, which is kind of hire slowly, fire quickly. Take the time to hire the right people. That might take longer and be sometimes more frustrating than you originally expect it to be. But if you do that well, you can put a great team in place. If you've made a mistake in that process, don't linger too long. Try and fix that, move on.
I think through hires that I've made over the years, even just for my own teams, and I won't call anybody out specifically, but rarely do you hire someone who you think's going to be a B player and they surprise you and become an A+ player. That's pretty rare, right? There are some times where you think you're hiring an A player and they're not. So to your point, being prudent and thoughtful and diligent about hiring, it's a lot easier to not hire someone than it is to remove someone from an organization.
Absolutely. And again, we're very lucky, I think, broadly in the sports industry, and I certainly would say we're very lucky in the organization that I'm privileged enough to lead, because actually we attract great candidates to roles. So we're not struggling to recruit from a lack of interest. It's about trying to find the right people for the right roles. And I think that's particularly important when you're putting the leadership team in place. And I've got a mixture now in a leadership team of probably half the team that have been in the organization for a number of years and half that are much newer. And that's a great balance to have, again, of institutional knowledge, but people challenging in a really good way. Why are we doing things in a certain way? And have we thought about it differently?
Think of your favorite people you've managed over the years. What are some of the common traits that they would share in how they work or how they act in an office environment?
I like openness. And again, I think we're lucky in the sports industry. We're in quite a collegiate environment most of the time. So I like people who are open and, again, quite vulnerable is always an interesting word, isn't it? But people just turning up and being themselves. I think, show yourself in what you do. It's not the case that I think you need to keep your personality aside certainly again in leadership. And in fact, quite the opposite. I think people are much more attracted to leaders who are being authentically themselves. So I think that's important, certainly important to me in the people I work with. Resilience, I think. I think, again, we're in a relatively small leadership team in an organization like ours. You need people who are going to get stuck in for each other. We travel a lot together. It's a lot of long hours. It's hard. We do a lot of weekend work. Our families make a lot of sacrifices. You're in that together. You need everybody to be in that together. One or two people not really pulling their weight soon upsets the balance, I think, in a team like that. So resilience, I think, is a really important trait in the people that certainly I've enjoyed working with. And just building that trust, I think, ultimately.
So when a new person comes into an organization and you're onboarding them, how do you get them to trust everyone around them? Have you had a good just track record of people automatically coming in and trusting already? Or do you have something within the culture that makes people feel psychologically safe to voice their opinion and to challenge someone?
To be honest, we've done some of that well in my time at World Rugby, and we've made some mistakes at times. And I think so. It's learning from those mistakes, isn't it? I mean, again, I think it's creating that environment where, in a leadership team, those who are coming in can see the level of trust and candidness that is in the team that's there, and encouraging them quickly, I think, into that environment. But that's spending time together, I think. So actually, I think in onboarding people coming into, particularly into a leadership team, but I think this is true in building any team, making sure the team are putting the time aside to bring that person in quickly, I think is really important. And again, I think we all felt coming out of COVID, we've nailed this. Getting together in person is not as important as we used to think it was, and we haven't got to all fly around the world to do that. I think we know that's not true. In person is the only way you can build that trust, really.
So your staff, you would have some in England, some in Ireland. Are there offices all around the world for World Rugby?
Not offices all around the world. We've got an office in Sydney. We always have an office really where our next World Cup is. Obviously, we've got one down near Twickenham Stadium for Women's World Cup this year. So a couple of offices actually in London currently, headquarters in Dublin, but pockets of staff around the world. We have staff who are our what we call regional partnership managers. So each of our 6 regions has some World Rugby staff attached. So we've got a pretty global footprint. I think as our finance people remind me, we're 16 payrolls. Wow. So that's the sort of sense of that footprint. And again, that's challenging, managing people across different time zones, different geographies, different cultures from a business perspective. But it's also one of the great kind of privileges of the role is, being part of a global organization and actually having the time to be exposed to different cultures and, to different countries. Again, it's easy to sometimes be negative about the amount of travel we all do. And that needs a lot of management from a personal energy perspective. But what a privilege to do a job you love and see different countries. 16
different payrolls. How do you maintain one culture, if you will, one set of values while allowing nuance of different markets?
Again, I think we're lucky in rugby. We're a very values-based sport. We need to protect and enhance that all the time. That's a distinguishing feature for us. It's something we definitely see as a point of difference, as a sales point, if you like, to corporate partners and brands we work with, to media partners, to fans. Ultimately, we're selling a set of values associated with rugby. We've also got to be careful not too worthy about that. I think you switch people off if you're a little bit too, values first, sort of ramming them down people's throats. So it's finding that balance. But I think when it comes to employees and culture, we're really lucky to have those values because most of the people involved in the organization have a real connection to those values and a connection, therefore, to our purpose. And I think that binds us together really well, despite there being, exactly to your point, different cultural nuances in that. And, to give you an example, and again, a lot of us spent a lot of time working in Japan for many years, building up to a sensational Rugby World Cup, a very special Rugby World Cup in 2019. Very, very different business and organizational culture for us. Frustrating at times. You learn a lot about yourself and then a lot about patience operating in those environments, but culturally so enriching. And now our relationships and our understanding and our ability to continue to drive value in those things is really important.
So we've worked across 31 countries over the years. And over time, you do learn that there are just unique ways of processing and communicating. So for example, there's a couple countries we work in where if an executive says something like, interesting, have you thought about it that way? What they really mean is, I don't like that idea and go in a different direction. But they didn't say it, right? They implied it or they think they implied it. And if you're not used to perhaps global workings, you miss some of that. How does someone build their cultural knowledge, their cultural ambidexterity? Because I'm sure you had to coming into this role.
Yeah, it's back to curiosity, I think. In part. And again, I think just taking the time, I think if you go into any of these roles with a very fixed mentality of it's going to be this way and we're going to push forward this way, you're limiting your own success. So I think there is and again, I'm naturally quite an impatient person. I want to see success and move on to the next thing. And I push, probably the organization forward that way. But actually there need to be those more patient moments of particularly again operating in different cultures. So I think it's trying to find the right balance, isn't it? Individually and collectively in the leadership teams that you work in to balance between the drive forward that you need, but the right pace to be learning, to be absorbing some of those opportunities to understand different cultures. And, it's interesting. I've kind of come full circle now. We're approaching a men's Rugby World Cup in Australia in 2 years' time. And my first professional involvement with World Rugby was Rugby World Cup in 2003 in Australia, and was I'm reminded as I'm now dealing with the Australian landscape a lot of what, that's a very different culture again. So, for example, working in the UK, it's probably a much more fast-paced business culture, more similar to the US, from my experience. So it's constantly sort of fascinating in that regard.
Yeah, we had Jack Buckner on the podcast before. Jack is at UK Athletics, and he tells a story about an apple orchard and just how it didn't work out well. It didn't work out the way that he wanted to. But all of his American friends were like, go for it. Sounds like a great idea. And then it wasn't as successful as he hoped. And he came back and all of his British friends were like, oh yeah, we thought it was a terrible idea. We just didn't tell you. I'm kind of summarizing his story, but just knowing how different cultures operate and act, and how some might be encouraging to the point where they don't give you the hard truth. Yeah. And some maybe don't find ideas as innovative or great, even when they might be. And just knowing how to filter is a skill set over time.
Absolutely. I mean, we've had the last couple of years, we've done some interesting things in World Rugby that probably our own stakeholders, our own shareholders, if you like, in terms of member unions, didn't expect us to do. I mean, to give you one example, we acquired a set of digital platforms in Rugby Pass, which we've now switched a streaming platform back onto. A really important part of our content strategy, a really important part of helping the game reach new audiences. But, as we started to go on that journey, you have your own, in fact, our own board to some extent saying, well, what do you mean you're acquiring a business? That's not what World Rugby does. Well, it is if it's the right thing to do within our strategy to take the next step. And so I think those, again, are the moments where probably we didn't play some of the communications as well as we should. So there's lots of learnings in those things. You've got to take your key stakeholders with you as much as possible, clearly, but actually showing people that we can think and act differently to try and be successful and try and deal with the challenges that are facing us. That's really interesting. So I think not even just different cultures, but within an organization like ours, showing people actually just because we haven't done these things before doesn't mean we shouldn't.
And even within cultures, there's biomes within there, aren't there? Because the finance department might have the same values as the sales department, but it doesn't mean their cultures act the same way along the way.
Absolutely. And I think, and again, I'm sure you see this in so many organizations, that natural tension between those that are, protecting the organization from risk and, in finance and other roles where they've really got a, close eye on a lot of the detail to the sales and marketing parts of organizations that are just trying to knock down the barriers and get out and do the business. So, and again, I think that's again, the constant challenge of leadership is finding the right balance across the organization between those things and not upsetting too many of those pieces.
I tour a lot of offices, and I'm still waiting for the day where I walk into a finance department and there's a bell and some alcohol and they celebrate every time they finish the close 3 days before when it's supposed to, or when the books balance perfectly, like the sales team. Just like some level of celebration for the hard work that they're doing too, but just have, again, different parts of the business have different amazing cultures.
It's funny, you mentioned London 2012 earlier. It was my first opportunity to be in a leadership role and be given probably at the time, more responsibility than I thought I could probably handle, but it was an amazing experience. I was kind of setting up and then running a business almost from scratch, but with some very experienced kind of stakeholders, shareholders behind the business. A brilliant project and opportunity, and I loved every part of it. But that was one part of it. We had an organization that was going to basically set up, design, deliver, and sell hospitality for the London Olympics. And it hadn't been done that way for any Olympic Games previously, so there wasn't a blueprint to follow. And immediately it was obvious that we had half of the organization that I was part of the leadership of that were very operationally focused, got to get on and deliver this, and very much planning and delivery people. The other part of the organization that was sales and marketing, ringing the bell, making a lot of noise, expecting to spend a lot of their budget on entertaining potential clients, and making sure that those two parts of the organization didn't resent each other, was actually probably a big part of my role for a period, and actually showing the sales and marketing team that they can't be successful without this group of operationally focused people, and vice versa, was really interesting. And again, ultimately just bringing people together, creating a shared vision and a shared purpose for them, and then trying to help them drive towards it in a fun way, again, working on something that was amazing fun.
So stay on that for a moment, because you made a comment of given more responsibility than perhaps you were ready for. All of us at times in our career face imposter syndrome. And if we don't, maybe we should. Maybe we should reduce our egos a little bit to actually have some imposter syndrome. How do you get over that, where you might think, I don't belong in this room? Surprise, I've found myself in this room. Is it a mindset? Is it authority? Is it looking at yourself in the mirror and reciting things?
I don't know, really. It's a great point. That example for me, I knew the people who were setting that business up very well, and it was being set up by a fantastic guy called Andrew Burton, who's no longer with us, sadly. But Andrew and I had known each other for a while, and he sort of plucked me out of what I was doing into that role, and it was such a great opportunity. Working on a home Olympic Games was, I'd highly recommend it to anybody. It's too good an opportunity to miss.
That had to be so special.
It was. I'm
going to ask you a question on that next.
Incredibly special. But so I had a very supportive CEO. I was the COO of that business, but I was sort of day to day running the business. So he was there when I needed him, and he was why he was a great leader and mentor was he knew when just to quietly step in to reassure, not step in and take over or undermine, but just to let you know he's there if you need him in a very subtle way, but give me enough rope to really, get on with it and enjoy it. And I think then from a personal perspective, you're reassured that you're not on your own. It's not all down to you, but being allowed to develop, I think, and drive that forward. And I think to your point, and again, it's about then trying to lap up all of the opportunity and the lessons and learn. I certainly learned a huge amount on that project, and there were things we did that didn't work, and we had some, lots of successes, but some failures. And, going back to the analogy about sport, I think, you genuinely learn certainly more, I think, from the things that are challenging and arguably the failures than you do from the successes, because you think harder about them and what you could have done differently. So that was an amazing project. And I have that imposter syndrome all the time. I still do now. I look back to the kid chopping wood for the local pub and you think, well, how do I end up here? And, and of course it's not a planned out straight route. It's a very opportunist route where you move where the opportunities are. But I pinch myself when I think about what I do.
So I can be a bit of a showboat at times. One of my first jobs was a valet. So if I have any chance to parallel park in front of people, I take that moment for them to see it.
Brilliant.
Does that play out for you at all? When wintertime comes around, are you the first to raise your hand and go, I'll make some firewood for you?
I'd love to.
I'd
love to. You're not allowed to do it anymore, are you? You're not allowed to admit that sort of real fire is a thing. But no, it's And again, I've been incredibly lucky. Genuinely at every stage of my life, let alone I wouldn't just call it career. Going back to that pub and right through to now, working with some amazing people, both in the boards that we have, in some of our membership, in the unions that we work with, within the teams in World Rugby. Just learning from great people. I think that's the sort of thrill of it. And I've been lucky to have brilliant mentors along the way, great colleagues. And again, I've traveled the world and had a lot of fun. I've worked very hard, but I've had a lot of fun doing it.
You worked London 2012. The likelihood that an Olympic game comes on your soil during your professional career and that you have the skill set necessary for one of the open jobs that are within that is incredibly small. Did you realize that at the moment as you got that job, or am I bringing that to life now? And then give me a couple of memories that still stand out to you, because that had to be a special time in your career.
Yeah, it was. But again, it's interesting. And the imposter syndrome piece came from, I didn't have any real experience in that space. We were spending, £100 million to build and deliver a hospitality program. We built at what was at that time next to the Olympic Stadium in London, the biggest hospitality structure that had ever been built, and did things differently again, some hugely innovative stuff. At the time, we had multiple venues across, some fixed venues and some temporary structures. So the scale of that, if I think about it now, let alone at the time, it scares me to think about the fact that we were doing that and pulling it off, and that I was, part of the leadership of that organization. So that was the exciting part of it. And as you say, to be doing that in what turned out to be such a special games, but in your home country, in your home city, was incredible. The great thing as well was, and I look around and many of these people, you look around the sort of world of the business of sport at the moment, there are, I come across a lot of people that I knew for the first time at London 2012 who've now gone on to be in brilliant leadership roles in sports. So it was a special moment, I think, for that springboarded a lot of people into their next role, and I was very lucky to be part of that.
I think the alumni base of London 2012 has to be the most successful alumni base of any Olympic game I've seen, of just the percentage of people who were there, who found their way into very senior leadership roles. There must have been something special going on inside those walls.
I think what the leadership of the organising committee did, so Paul Dighton and others, obviously Sebco leading the organisation and bringing people like Lord Dighton in, was they understood that the scale of the challenge was such that it couldn't be just another collection of the normal sports execs, I think. And they brought people in again. To some of the points we've talked about, they brought people in from different industries, took a different mindset about some of the challenges, and mixed that with some brilliant experience. People who'd worked across multiple games, seen some of the challenges before. It's such a complex operation to deliver Olympic Games. So many moving parts. Obviously, we've just seen a brilliant Olympic Games in Paris last year. Again, some brilliantly talented people involved in that game. So, I think that's where that incubation of some great young minds into future leadership roles took place.
Earlier, you talked about curiosity a few times, saying how important it is to be curious. If I'm someone who lacks curiosity, how do I develop that?
I think we've all got it somewhere. I think we're naturally curious. I think it's a sort of human trait. And so I think for people who maybe don't think they're curious, it's just about how do you switch that on? And again, I use my kids as an example. I think it's about showing different experiences, isn't it? And giving people a glimpse of different things, and they'll pick up on the bits of that are interesting to them. But also, again, giving people permission to be curious. I think, again, when we look at business, people sometimes assume that you've got to become an expert in what it is you do. And that, of course, is true to a point. You have to have the core skills to deliver the role you're in. But actually being curious about other people's role in the organization or other people's roles in other organizations is a big part of that personal development piece, I think. And it's interesting, didn't necessarily set out on the journey to become CEO of a sports organization, didn't necessarily at many points on the journey think that was going to happen. It has happened. Again, it's a huge privilege. But I'm already thinking about what's next. I'm already, I spend my time thinking about what skills do I need to develop and learn to do whatever comes next in my career. And again, which is a fortunate position to be in, how can I help others now develop those skills?
Yeah, I listened to Adam Grant on a podcast recently, and he has a book that I need to actually read because I quote him on the podcast, and I should probably quote him on the book. But in it, he shares the story that we've all heard about how it takes 10,000 hours to be an expert. But what he brought up in it is that it takes 20 hours to be decent at something. And if you do 20 hours of chess or sourdough making or studying of marketing or woodshop, you're probably better than 99% of the population.
Absolutely.
For only doing 20 hours. Yeah. And so you're working new muscles. You might develop new interests. You're becoming more interesting to people. And I find that naturally develops curiosity. I'm on my own sourdough journey right now. I haven't gotten full 20 hours in yet, although it takes about 12, it seems like, for me to get a single loaf out. So I'll get there. But it's a great experience. Dan, who does all of the video for this, is like an expert at sourdough. So he sends me his pictures all the time and reminds me that I haven't reached it yet.
Just to make you feel inadequate.
It makes me feel inadequate for sure. I had a improv teacher back in the day. Keegan Michael Key is his name. I saw him the other day at Super Bowl. And one of the games he always had us play was one character is doing any activity and the other character needs to be fascinated by whatever that activity is.
Yeah.
It made for some of the most entertaining scenes because whether the person was shopping at the grocery store or whether they were hunting, the other character is fascinated by this person. It's actually great to bring into life, isn't it? When someone talks to you, just choose to be fascinated by what they're talking about.
So right. Absolutely. I think once you start to do that, and show an interest, you find yourself asking more and more questions. You're engaged in a different way, and suddenly, as you say, you might have to force yourself to be fascinated in the first instance, but it doesn't take long actually just to be interested in what people are saying. And again, we're in a world where consumer habits are, our world's changing so fast that if you're not fascinated by what's going on, you're just going to fall behind. And that's definitely true in the industry we're in.
I get called a coffee snob, and it's not actually that. If I'm traveling for work, I have the choice of going to a place where someone serves me coffee or going to a place where someone has spent their life obsessing over serving me coffee. Yeah. And there is a distinct difference. And I love showing up at the place where this is this person's craft and passion. Yeah. Sometimes they might taste similar. Usually they don't. Usually one tastes distinctly better than the other. And I love that type of energy.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
If someone is on their journey to be a CEO, they're a chief level executive, and they're trying to differentiate themselves from perhaps the competitive pool, as I air quote over here, how does a general counsel or a chief marketing officer, a CFO, or a chief human resources officer start to differentiate themselves to prepare from being functional expert to broad leader?
It's a great question, and I don't think there's a sort of simple answer to it. I think, and I guess, again, I've sort of lived a bit of that journey, and I've been lucky because I ironically wasn't a functional expert at anything. So I think there's a bit of that in it. You need to be able to show that you are capable of understanding all of the different roles and responsibilities, I think. So again, my sort of broad background was definitely helpful for me in that regard. So I think if somebody is looking at that and they are a very functional specialist, again, it's probably back to being fascinated by other people's roles and just learning a bit. Doesn't mean you've got to go in and impose yourself and do those roles, and certainly don't try and kid those that you're trying to convince that you do have all that, deep functional expertise, because actually that's not what, a recruiter or a board is looking for in that CEO role. And, sometimes you have to be that kind of mile wide and an inch deep in parts of the organization rather than a mile deep and an inch wide, I think. And that's, so it's finding that balance. But again, it's about leadership skills, isn't it? And developing your own style of being authentic, understanding what's going to take to lead an organization. I remember people saying to me before I was in this role, it's quite a lonely place to be a CEO. And some days I think that's so untrue because you're surrounded by great people. The part of the sort of loneliness factor, I think, of being a CEO that's true is ultimately, the buck stops with you. And you're going to get pressure from above, from a board and from shareholders or stakeholders, and you're going to get the pressure that you have to drive the organization and the team forward. And sometimes that can feel like a lot of pressure. And you've either got to sort of take that and thrive and work, build your team to share that pressure with, or it can be, I think, overwhelming for people.
It's not for everybody. I know a lot of people who think they want to be a CEO. Sometimes I'll just remind them, you do realize how materially your job is going to change. If you're a marketer and you love being creative, that becomes a significantly smaller part of your day job. And if anything, you should hire a really good chief marketing officer who takes that off you so you can go learn the other elements. Do you really want that?
It's so true. And actually, I think you're right. It's not for everybody. And I think that's an important message also in succession planning and career planning within an organization or business is to try and show that, you shouldn't all be competing for this role. And it is, I think, a certain, set of skills and sort of personality traits that will make people successful or not in that space. And again, I probably wasn't that thoughtful about that before I was in the role, if that makes sense, which has been interesting. And I also think, as well as not being for everybody, you don't, once you become a CEO, I don't necessarily think the next thing I do will be to be a CEO somewhere else. And that's okay too, I think, is, what's the next part of the journey for anybody who is in that role? It might not be to be a CEO, sort of career CEO. So, and actually I miss lots of parts of my old job. So I irritate the people who are doing my old job now, because I loved, to your point about loving being a chief marketing officer, I loved running Rugby World Cups. It's the thing I was most passionate about our sport. So when the Rugby World Cups come around, they are quite rightly saying, get out of my lane. You're not doing this anymore. So, it's understanding that you're not always going to want to do those things.
But to your point, though, as a CEO, sometimes you do need to know when to go 100 feet down to the ground versus 30,000 feet. When do you find that balance? Like, what is the right balance, should I say, of staying 30,000 feet above sea level versus coming all the way in?
Yeah, it's hard. I think that's a constant sort of battle, as you know, within yourself. I'm certainly not doing a perfect job of that, but what I'm finding is when I look at the really wide range of things we do, I know I need to be across everything we do enough to be a valuable leader to the organization. There are lots of things that I'm not an expert at in those things, so I need to have the right people in place to do that. Where are the things that I can add the most value and have the most impact, or where I need to make decisions that only really I can make? And again, that's never really true because you're always working with colleagues and hopefully a supportive board in a CEO role. But the most, the decisions that rely most with you, those are the ones I think to then go deeper on, so that you're making those decisions with the best information, the best facts, the best knowledge, and stay out of the way of the others. And again, that's about, I think, building a great leadership team with trust in each other, so that you are trusting your colleagues to make the right decisions when you're not doing that directly, and they also trust you to step in the right places and add that value. And I think, again, that takes a bit of time, everyone understanding that they're in it together. And I always say to, again, people that I work with in any type of organization, we can't all be afraid to make the wrong decisions. We're all going to make some wrong calls. And if we spend too much of our time obsessing about that, then you're in kind of paralysis as an organization from a decision-making point of view. The key thing is not to make the same mistake twice. Then you're in the stupidity zone, right? If you're making a decision based on great information and you're trying to move the organization forward and be successful, and it turns out that decision wasn't the right decision, learn fast and move on from that.
Is there anything we didn't talk about today that you wanted to talk about?
Oh, I don't think so. I mean, a great look back. It's funny when you look back at your career and you think, wow, that sounds brilliant. And you think, well, I didn't plan any of that really. But no, it's been an amazing journey. And again, my advice always to people coming into our industry is absorb as much as you can, be as self-aware and self-reflective as you can, ask as many questions of people, back to curiosity and learning as you can. There are no stupid questions in terms of trying to learn more and be successful in your individual area and learn as much about everything else as you can as you go.
The only stupid question I've ever heard is, what do you mean I'm not getting a ticket? I was speeding. That's one that I don't think is a very wise question.
Yeah, and any question you keep asking 3 or 4 times, that becomes a stupid question after a while.
It does. So we're going to transition to 7 questions we ask everybody. 7 question blitz. So the first one, what sports event have you never been to that you would love to attend?
It's an easy one for me. And every year I say the same thing at the start of the year, that I'm going to nail this, and I haven't. So Masters golf. I mean, I've since I was a kid, I've watched the most beautiful, setting for a sports event in the world at Augusta, and I haven't made it yet. So
why haven't you made it yet?
Because I keep doing stupid things that involve work at the same time, and I never quite get there. So there is a point coming very soon where I'm going to do that.
You need to. 3 people then, living or historic, that you would love to play a round of golf with.
Definitely Nelson Mandela. I just think he's, one of the most fascinating leadership stories the world has seen. He's very important in our sport, the kind of whole 1995 Rugby World Cup moment with Mandela. So I think it would be amazing to spend time with Mandela. I'm probably surprisingly going to say Donald Trump. It'd be fascinating to know if he really does cheat at golf in the way that people say, but also just at a moment in time where the influence that he's having obviously on the world.
And he has some nice golf courses.
So he can host. And then probably a family member. I mean, I would say my wife, because she definitely is the one who gives me the best advice and would call me out on the golf course and find it hilarious how bad at golf I am. But she doesn't play golf. So maybe my son, my 17-year-old son. And I think he'd quite enjoy Trump and Mandela.
Yeah. Oh, that'd be an entertaining duo for sure.
Yeah.
It'd be good memories to have together. As you look back on sporting memories, you've been to many, you've seen many, you've witnessed many. What one do you hold nearest and dearest to your heart?
I have to say, I think Johnny Wilkinson kicking the drop goal that won England the 2003 World Cup. As England rugby fans, we all sat there thinking this was the start of a golden era where we're going to win loads of World Cups. Obviously, it hasn't happened since, but it was my first the first World Rugby World Cup that I worked on. So I sort of sat there at the final match, regardless of whether England or Australia won, with this incredible kind of sense of pride at being involved in something that was incredibly special, with brilliant colleagues. And then for England to win the game in the way they did so dramatically, going back to sporting drama, was incredible. So that's probably the real standout. That and Daley Thompson at the Los Angeles Olympics in '84, who I was just fascinated by. Yeah, I'm looking forward to LA 28 because '84 is kind of burnt in my mind as this standout kind of sporting moment. I never thought at that point I'd find myself working in this industry. So
yeah, I'm spoiled being on American soil, getting a World Cup and an Olympics back to back coming around the corner.
Yeah, you got some real events coming.
And then Rugby World Cup's right behind that.
Yeah, it's going to be amazing.
What's something about you most people wouldn't know?
Most people wouldn't know, because I'm fairly vertically challenged, that I was actually a very good basketball player, and it's kind of along with rugby, my sort of main sport. So I played a lot of basketball in university, college level in the UK. I played sort of semi-pro basketball for a while. I thought I might have a chance of making a very short career out of it. It didn't really work out. But yeah, I'm pretty basketball obsessed. So if I'm not watching rugby or Liverpool, I'm probably watching basketball. Do
you have an NBA team or a favorite NBA player?
I do. I always say the Bulls because I grew up in the kind of Michael Jordan obsessed era, but I actually have always loved the Celtics more. That kind of I think, I was watching basketball, which was not easy in the UK, I have to tell you, in the late 80s, and you kind of had to follow the Celtics or the Lakers. And the Lakers were all glitz and glamour, and I grew up chopping wood in the country, as we've already established. So I was on the other end of that spectrum. So Lakers weren't my team, and the Celtics, the hard-working but successful Celtics, definitely were. So I still follow the Celtics a bit. So we'll see how they go this season.
They're not hard to follow now.
No, they're doing all right now.
Do you have any professional pet peeves? You actually gave one earlier, but I'm not going to remind you what it was to see if maybe you have a different one that shows up.
Probably a couple. I was going to say laziness. No one's ever lazy in their work, but I think, putting the shift in, doing the hard yards, it's got to be a given. So anyone who's not doing that, I think, is a pet peeve for me. That's got to be the sort of starter for 10 is you're putting the shift in and everything else flows from there. So whenever I see someone who's not maybe doing as much as they could, I'd probably call that out.
If you weren't CEO of World Rugby, you couldn't work in sports, and lumberjack was off the table, what would be your career?
I've always been a wannabe chef. And it probably goes back to that same village pub where I started chopping wood, because I ended up working in the kitchen there, and I'm a real foodie. So yeah, I would love to have been a chef it's probably about as unsociable in terms of hours as this job. So I wouldn't have minded it. Yeah, I love cooking.
Are you good in the kitchen?
I'm pretty good, I think. I'd love to do more of it and spend more time doing it. So I think when I finally escaped the travails of being a CEO, I'll definitely spend more time cooking.
And so one day when we're both at the same place and there's a great kitchen and you're trying to impress me, what are you going to prepare?
I love Japanese food, having again spent a lot of time in Japan. That's one of the joys of traveling with a job. I love trying different foods and again experiencing actually different cultures through their food. I think is always a fascinating experience.
So you're going to go all teppanyaki on me or something?
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, yeah. I love that.
Yeah.
I'm in.
Yeah.
And then next time I'm in your hometown, where should I go to eat?
Oh, look, it depends, I guess. It depends what you want to eat. London's, as you know, such a great city for restaurants. And I know there's, I spent a lot of time in France, and the French always joke about British food, but begrudgingly recognise that London's got a pretty vibrant restaurant scene. So I think if there's not a million miles from here, Goodman's is one of my favourite places for a steak and a glass of red wine. Fantastic. Again, heritage, tradition place. Love Goodman's. Should call Hawksmoor out in that regard as well, who are also fantastic. I love Veeraswamy. I don't know if you've ever been to Veeraswamy.
I love Veeraswamy.
One of the oldest Indian restaurants, I think, in Europe.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
I think it's the oldest in the country, isn't it?
Yeah, it's certainly the oldest in the UK. Beautiful food. And actually recently I was in Perth for our Sevens event, and we had our board together in Perth, and we ate in a Nobu restaurant in Perth, talking of Japanese food, and it was absolutely sensational. And I was reminded actually that Nobu in London is special too. So yeah, depending on what you want to eat, I think we do all right in London.
Yeah, there's a great food scene in London. Alan, so fun spending time with you. Thanks for coming this way and letting us have this engaging conversation.
Thanks for having me on, Chad. Loved it.